Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a lovely lunch, and if you went to any of the breakout sessions, I hope they were informative. Just a word on the session that is taking place after this session. Unfortunately, the Mayor's Dialogue is no longer taking place because we've been informed the Mayor of Madrid cannot travel to Barcelona, so we're really sorry about that. We are going to extend this session a little bit more by having a Q&A at the end, so if you do have any questions, please do have a little think whilst Beth is talking. And there are also parallel sessions taking place in the other rooms, so please do head to them. Let me introduce our first inspirational talk of the day. Beth Noveck is the founder and director of the Governors Lab, which aims to learn how to use technology to govern more effectively. She's also a professor at the NYU Tandem School of Engineering, where she teaches governance innovation. In this keynote, she will talk about the challenges and successes when it comes to engaging with citizens in people-led innovation. So please give a warm round of applause to Beth Noveck.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm really delighted and honored to be here in Barcelona for the topic of people-led innovation and citizen engagement in government and in creating smarter cities. There is perhaps no better place, no more forward-thinking place in terms of the use of technology to engage with citizens in new ways than here in Barcelona. And I'm hoping to share some of those experiences and some of what's going on around the world. 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of being on this stage and talking about the fact that the key ingredient of a smart city is its citizens, is the smart citizens who live in our cities. But I have found that even in the interim over the last 2 years, there has been, number one, an explosion of new activity and experiments that we'll talk about today. But there is still a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of concern and fear about how to effectively and efficiently engage with the public in solving problems in new ways. So I'm here to talk for a few minutes today about a common theme, one that we still need to work on, which is how we can make our institutions more effective. And even the most effective cities, and I think we can all agree that at the urban, at the municipal, at the city level, things work better than they do perhaps elsewhere, but they don't work as well as they ought to. Our institutions are not as effective, they're not as agile as they could be in taking advantage of the solutions that technology, that science, that big data provide to us today to solve new problems. Government is perceived not as the enabler, not as the catalyzer of innovation, but in fact as the impediment. It has a real image problem. People want government to do more. They want it to do better, to deliver better services, to enable better and more resilient communities, even as budgets are declining and decreasing. We have phenomenal challenges that we are struggling with, and which cities, not just nation states, are being asked to tackle, especially around climate change. And yet we don't have a way, we don't have the effective mechanisms that we need, I would put to you, not simply to tap into the opinions of citizens, but citizen expertise, what the public knows and can do, and to engage with people more than just at the ballot box. We tend to define democracy and to think that it's good enough simply to encourage people to vote. And I would put to you that we can do better, that we can reimagine and invent our processes on top of voting, which we must strengthen, and above all, on top of the plebiscites that are available to us. We need, in no more time urgently than today, to take advantage of and to listen to our own communities, the opinions that people have, the values that they hold, and the expertise and know-how and experience that they share, and to use that to reinvent and reimagine how we govern. To think about governing and government not as a one-way process from elites on the top down, but as a two-way conversation that happens between institutions and citizens to solve problems. We've typically, as we've talked about open government and government innovation, focused on, I would say, the easier thing to do, and it's not that easy, which is transparency. We still have a long way to go, but we all understand the value of more evidence-based decision-making. We know that data can help us to be more effective in analyzing how we deliver services and doing a better job of doing so in the future. But I would put to you, transparency is not enough. And in many cases, as many people will argue, in fact, it may be counterproductive. Now, I'm not talking now about the sensors that allow us to know where the traffic is moving. I'm talking about the transparency that then often causes partisanship and politics to become more intense, to become more exaggerated, and potentially the ways we make law and policy to become less effective. Again, at the national level, there are significant problems. Trust in parliaments and Congress in the United States could not be any lower than it is. And that is very much because lawmaking is not of the quality that it needs to be. The laws that we create do not achieve their intended purpose. So putting to one side, whether we're left or right, what the substance of those laws are and of those policies are, I would argue that we can always make our laws and policies more effective. That is, the solution better tailored to solve the problems that we're facing. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, the work that we need to do in the coming years that has already begun all around the world, is to look at how civic or public engagement might help us to improve the quality of how we make law and policy. So this is why, whoops, see if that does something. There has, for a long time, since the 1920s, when John Dewey and Walter Lippmann wrote their famous books, The Phantom Public and The Public and Its Problems, they had a debate about what was the appropriate role of citizens versus experts in society. Lippmann was of the view that governing should be done by experts. Dewey was of the view that governing and the way that we share ideas and information should not be done by experts, but should engage the ordinary person. But I would put to you they were both wrong. And they were wrong in the way that technology has changed for us today. And that is that Dewey, even though he was in favor of public engagement and mass participation and the education of citizens, didn't think much more of citizens than Lippmann did. They didn't have the view that we start from today, which is that expertise is widely distributed in society. Expertise not understood only as university credentials, but as lived experience. The person who lives in a community, who commutes to work, who goes to school, who receives medical services, has as much know-how about what it means to live in a city as does someone with 4 PhDs. So if we start from the proposition that expertise is widely distributed, and we can use technology to tap into it in a way that Dewey and Lippmann could not have imagined in the 1920s, we have this chance to build platforms and processes that could allow us to do so. But we have two challenges. One is that these platforms and processes, as they exist today, many are very promising, but I would say that in large part, the designs are not as good as they could be. And that is very much because we don't have a clear vision about what these platforms are designed to accomplish. Look, it's hard to do this. And when I worked for President Obama in the first Obama administration, even before we started, I had this brilliant idea that we should, instead of sitting in a closed room, a few people decide what the president's agenda should be for the first 100 days of office, known as the transition period, that we should ask the American public what they thought our agenda should be. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Well, you know what happened? We got, and this won't surprise you given Obama's popularity at the start of his first term, we got over 80,000 proposals, 88,000 proposals. Do you know what happened to those proposals? Do you know how many of them were used to make policy in the Obama administration? 0, correct, thank you. We had no way to make use of that information because the process was poorly designed. There was nobody, they designed the website to ask the question, but there was nobody to read what was received at the other end. We have a vision, and there have been long-standing civic engagement practices, some of which have taken advantage of new technology, like deliberative polling, which was developed out of Stanford University and has been practiced all around the world. But deliberative polling is designed for a specific purpose, namely to measure changes in public opinion by getting people to engage. It's not designed to lead to a decision. It's not designed to lead to a new law or policy. It's not designed to change outcomes. So to that extent, it works very well for what it is, a social science experiment to measure changes in opinion, but it doesn't do very much as a process to allow us to make better informed law or policy. Citizen juries have been around for many, many years, and they were developed, they've been used in Denmark in particular, they've been used in Canada and the States. The idea of picking a small group of citizens, and like a jury, like a criminal jury in the TV movies from the United States, these small groups of ordinary people help with bringing more democracy to hard decisions. The Danish used it to make a lot of hard tech and science-related decisions 25 years ago. But again, these only engage small numbers of people because they're designed to improve the legitimacy of decision-making, but not necessarily their effectiveness. So we see lots of new examples, though, of engaging with citizens, as Mexico City did, and the lab of Mexico City, to engage with riders of buses to get them to map the informal system of little minibuses and to thereby create a map of the transportation system that didn't exist before, something that had a real outcome. And we see lots of these kinds of projects. In South Australia, they're doing participatory budgeting in a big way, giving $40 million over to citizens to decide how to spend on neighborhood projects. NGOs like Amnesty International have thousands of people looking at and cataloging satellite pictures to spot human rights abuses. We're seeing more and more examples of this idea of crowdsourcing or open innovation, getting the public to do more than share an opinion, but to actually engage in a task, to share know-how, to do hard work together, to the end of solving hard problems. But we're just beginning to marry these crowdsourcing processes to more traditional legal practices of lawmaking and policymaking. In Costa Rica, as in Mexico, in the city of Monterrey, they've just started this year the process of co-creating solutions to hard problems with citizens in this Desafios Challenge project that actually engage with citizens, working together with city officials, not simply to come up with good ideas, but then to go through learning and coaching and training together over several weeks to develop those ideas into implementable solutions. So just to give one example, a team of citizens working with the city's urban planners were able to go from a city in which over 85% of school children are driving by car to school to 1 year later, a city in which under 3% of kids are now driving to school, thanks to a project, that was designed by citizens together with city officials. Why? Because the riders of the buses, the parents of the school children, they knew more than the city officials alone about how to do this. So the idea that I want to put to you, this is exploding all around the world. It's happening, more and more of these examples. Here in Barcelona, the Decidim platform is enabling exactly this kind of community engagement here as well. And I think, and I want to put to you, that we need more cities systematically engaging in the process and practice of what I would call crowd law. In other words, actually using new technology to get people to co-create solutions to problems, and to do so also when it comes to traditional law and policy making. They're doing it now in Brazil. They're doing it in Colombia. This is the Mi Senado app in Colombia. They're doing it in Taiwan. trust me, that's what that says, is they are beginning to use technology to engage people now, to go beyond the hackathons and the mapathons and the challenges, to actually now look at new ways of engaging formally in the lawmaking process. But we're only at the beginning. Most of these examples tend to focus on the very early stages of the lawmaking process. Right? They tend to focus on the suggestions for what we should legislate about, to identify the problem that's at issue. They may engage in a process of inviting people to draft something together, to suggest language. But they tend not to focus yet as much on getting the public engaged in actually developing solutions, or even more important, monitoring and evaluating laws once they are created. So in Brazil this past year, they enacted a new law on requiring children to have access to a healthy school lunch. And not the government, but an NGO started a project to ask school kids to take pictures of their lunch, to actually measure and evaluate the effectiveness of that policy, to act as citizen monitors, to allow us to understand, are the laws that we're making, are they actually working in the way that we intend? So imagine, for example, if we were going to create a new policy, let's say, as Madrid has worked on a contamination plan for the city, disaster response plan. How much better that plan could be if it was informed by public engagement. Not public opinion, but public expertise. Imagine if we're making a new law or policy about educational quality and the performance of our schools. How much better it could be if we actually engaged with teachers and with students and families. Now you might say, that's nothing new, right? We have interest groups. We have lobbyists. This is what they do. We have teachers' unions. The goal here, again, is not about simply hearing opinions. It's about getting expertise. And that's why it's important to open up these processes more broadly to individuals as well as to groups, to tap into the know-how that we might otherwise be missing. So in closing, let me share a few recommendations about how we might do this. And tomorrow I will be in Madrid speaking, actually tomorrow and the next day, to the regional workshopping with the members of the Regional Assembly and the City Council, exactly trying to explore, can we begin to adapt and adopt these crowd law processes in practice? So if there are any cities in the room or anybody who may be interested in trying these new ways of working, I want to put an offer to you to be helpful and supportive, to help to share the best practices of the 25 cities now who are already doing things, and to be useful in any way that we can to try to encourage the adoption of these engagement practices. So very quickly, 10 key design recommendations. Number one, and the one most often overlooked, which is if we're going to design for citizen engagement, we have to design not simply for citizens, but for institutions. We do a great job at building civic technology that is user-friendly and designed for the public to know how to engage. But what we lack, just as we did in that Obama example, is we lack the work and investment in actually mapping and understanding how do the institutions, how do the cities, how do the city councils need and use information, and can we better marry those processes to one another? Engagement is only going to lead to positive outcomes if we design for both clients, the individual and the institution. We need to design to achieve the desired goal. If our goal is to measure changes in public opinion, deliberative polling is right. If our goal is to build greater legitimacy, we may want a citizen jury. If our goal, however, is to get at the best facts or the best statistics or the best examples of people's experience in their own communities to the end of developing a functional and implementable policy or service, we may in fact need a different design and a different process. So it's important to have in mind, if our goal is legitimacy, it may be very different than if our goal is to get better expertise. We can do both, but we should be clear on what we're designing for and what features will lead to which results. We have to then also know who's going to manage the process, right? We can open the floodgates to participation, but there better be somebody who's listening and who's willing to take that information and that input seriously and use it. Otherwise, it will just lead to greater frustration and depress participation rather than encourage it. So that means we have to plan not just how we're going to encourage people to sign up or to tweet or to post or to share something, but again, how we're going to use the information that they give us. Focusing on incentives, as with any platform, is crucial. Why will people participate? Well, first and foremost, people are going to participate if they see their participation as being useful and relevant. So again, I would encourage us to forego civic engagement if we're not going to take it seriously, if we're not going to actually use the input we receive to lead to better outcomes. Obviously, but not always practiced, the need to explain how to participate and why and how one's information will be used. And that can very often mean being very clear about how we protect or respect people's privacy. So for example, on the Decide engagement platform that Madrid uses, they have a system, a tiered level of privacy versus accountability, where there are ways you can engage without sharing your name and who you are. But some levels of participation and engagement very intentionally require authentication. It is important in order to get people to come back and in order to demonstrate that civic engagement is taken seriously, to actually share the outcomes of final decisions. That may seem self-evident, but it is generally the practice that we will have town hall meetings, that we will use apps, that we will ask people, but we then never share how their input was actually used or taken account of. Finally, we need to obviously diversify opportunities to engage so we don't risk excluding people who cannot participate online, nor do things only offline that exclude people who can only participate with the convenience of an online platform. And finally, let me say that we need to test what works. What I'm putting to you today, despite the fact that we have dozens of examples of engagement using new technology, is still very experimental. We have to try things, and we actually have to measure what works. This may mean we need to legislate, we actually need to legislate the need to practice engagement, but then we should also legislate the need to measure what works and to evaluate it. And I'll close by saying that at crowd.law, the website, we've put up these recommendations in English and in Spanish. We've also put up some model statutory language for a city to consider when legislating public engagement. Whatever we do, we should take account of the fact that this presents the most important opportunity we have to engage with people up and down the pyramid, up and down the socioeconomic ladder. And we have to take seriously the expertise that people have in every walk of life, in every place that they live, and to use technology to make the opportunity to hear from people manageable and easy. It is an experiment. It's an experiment what social scientists refer to as an experiment in the wild, something we have to try while we're doing it. And I've written about this importance of how we do experiments in the wild. So now let me just close my last slide by saying that it is precisely an experiment, and therefore we have to ask for ourselves and answer a series of very hard questions. The answer to some of which may be that civic engagement is not the answer, and it doesn't work at every stage or in every place or in every process. But if we ask ourselves what the benefits could be, we may pleasantly surprise ourselves that we have a chance to engage with individuals and groups, with the collective intelligence of our communities, to improve the outcomes of how we make law, how we make policy, and how we govern. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. Do you want to take a seat and we can open up to questions from the audience? So we are taking questions on the app, and we've also got 2 mics in the audience. So I'm going to start with the one on the app, and then if someone wants to ask one live, then please do. Okay, so first of all, I've got a question from Larry. He said, how and by whom should be decided which matters should be handled by co-creation and citizen participation, and which by City Council?
Great question. So I would like to see all matters that city councils, in other words, the crowd law concept speaks to the fact that all legislative matters should actually involve and engage the public. I think, again, that only works when we have well-developed processes that are efficient. If it hamstrings, if it essentially grinds lawmaking to a halt, we're not ready to do that. But I think there's no reason why we shouldn't use technology to allow the public, number one, to suggest what we should be legislating. Number two, to then help us to understand if we want to legislate something around traffic, or we think there's a challenge around traffic or climate change or healthcare, to help better define and understand what the problem is that we're trying to solve. What is the problem in our community that we're solving? What are the solutions that we might devise? We need much better thinking than we have today. I'll give you an example. Last week I was having lunch with a city council person in a city that shall remain nameless. And he explained to me how his colleague just introduced a bill saying that buildings should not be too tall. I said, well, that's an interesting bill. What problem is that actually designed to solve? No idea. But he wanted to be associated with, he wanted to get his foot in the door having proposed legislation saying that buildings should not be too tall. And presumably there's a rationale with regard to quality of life. But again, this is precisely a place, rather than having the proposal as made by this legislator, buildings should not be too tall, how much better would it be if we had a simple process for identifying what the problem is that is associated with tall buildings, identifying whether there's a range of solutions that might be less burdensome, in fact, to solve that problem than capping the height of all buildings, getting a sense potentially of where public opinion is on that issue, potentially getting help with drafting that in a way that would actually allow us to measure the outcomes, and then evaluating that. So I think, long story short, there's an opportunity for 2 kinds of engagement. One with regard to expertise and know-how, the other with regard to public opinion and values, but that have a place when done manageably at every stage in the process.
I think that nicely leads on to this next question that says, how can we distinguish from citizen amateur knowledge from expertise? So where citizen amateur knowledge to expertise, is there a line that you draw there?
No, not really. I think, the notion that experts in our, well, let me put it this way. In every community, we should be governing with the benefit of the best ideas and thinking. It is true that we should not be limited to the expertise that sits only geographically within our borders and boundaries. Why would we not? And this, by the way, is the root of a project we've been doing at the GovLab for several years called the Smarter Crowdsourcing Project, where what we do is we work with a public sector partner who has a hard problem, and we go to global experts. We use the net to find 100 people around the world with good ideas and experience for the best thinking. So in other words, that expertise may be widely distributed, but it also may be in our own backyard. And I think the notion of distinguishing between some fictional concept of the expert as different from the citizen is a really outdated and elitist concept. The truth is that everyone has some kind of expertise. It might, again, be learned expertise from university courses. It might be work experience related. Based on professional experience and know-how. It might come from, again, being, we all know we're patients, right? And we all know today that if you have a disease, you have as much expertise, but of a different kind than your doctor does. You know what it's like to live with that disease, to manage your condition, to support a family member who has that disease. That is an important and valid form of know-how that is a distinct form of expertise. And I think the point is we have to recognize they're on a spectrum, but we have to recognize all of them as valid and important to how we design law and policy.
Let's open it up to the floor. Are there any questions on the floor? We've got lots coming in from the app, but if anyone would like to ask a question. Oh, hello. Yes.
Okay, I'm from Israel. I'm a co-founder of the Israel Smart Cities Institution. I'm working for many years on the topic of citizen participation, engagement, whatever you called it. And now I'm engaged in another topic called citizen science. You have a very nice presentation. But I would like to know if you can give us some examples of bottom-up. That's the title of your presentation. How really citizens are engaged in policy making together with the city hall or other officials in the city.
So just to go back to the very local example, I think that's one of the ideas that drives, well, let me take one step back. Citizen science is obviously the exemplar of how to do many of these things well. And we know that citizen science has two branches. Citizen science, the projects that are driven and led by, let's call them a professional scientist working in a university, who crowdsources or engages with distributed experts to extend his or her own capacity by asking citizens to, you know, measure air quality samples or water quality samples or identify the shape of galaxies or engage in protein folding games. So those are the citizen science top-down examples. There's then a whole movement around civic science, right? Those are the citizen-led efforts that are independent of institutions, like SafeCast in Japan, which organized communities, public communities, to measure radiation after post-Fukushima Japan. And now they have citizens in 150 countries measuring not just radiation, but also air quality. And that's very much a bottom-up example that's had a profound impact on public policy because of its activities. And I think you're absolutely right that there are and need to be both of those. In Madrid, as here in Barcelona, there is this concept of the propuesta, you know, the citizen proposal, where the citizens say, and many countries have this concept of the kind of petition, we would like legislation around X. I will give you one guess as to the #1 citizen-requested policy proposal from Madrid. Anybody? Do we have anybody from Madrid in the room? #1 quality of life issue. Any Madrileños in the room? Well, it happens to be, I'm not joking about this, though it is funny, it happens to be, how should we say this politely, dog poop, I think would be the polite term. There are thousands of proposals about doing something about dogs in Madrid. So that is a bottom-up. I thought it was very funny when I read that, but maybe you all have dogs. I'm a cat person, so I thought it was funny. I think that you're right, that the idea of letting the public set the agenda, in other words, make proposals, engage in bottom-up work, is extraordinarily important. It's also what we're talking about, not to the exclusion of projects that are entirely citizen or NGO-led and driven and that don't involve institutions at all. But what I don't want to see us do is to miss the opportunity to use the convening power, spending power, and public purpose of our public institutions to let them continue to work behind closed doors and as a top-down and just depend on civil society to organize these efforts instead of trying to do both and have both be bottom-up.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to just move on to the app. This has been voted the most popular question. What if citizens say what they don't really mean? How can you tell the difference and implement the genuine feedback? Most popular for a reason.
How many seconds do we have left? Let me say at the outset, so let me give the frustratingly non-answer answer first to that question, which is to say or to admit that as I'm talking about engagement in lawmaking processes, we have to be skeptical, right? We now have engagement. If you're American, you know what that means. It's called $3 billion in lobbying, and that's just what we can count. And by the way, some of those lobbyists are good guy lobbyists and some are the bad guy lobbyists, but we know that engagement processes can be distorted in a wide variety of ways. And if we design them poorly, it only makes it worse. So I don't want to suggest, I can't sit here and say 42 is the answer, which is why we need to do more experiments, which is why we need to legislate more engagement, but not as if we know what the answer is or the platform is or the way to do things are, and that we know what will work when, because of precisely questions like this, which is because we don't want engagement to turn into a far worse version of the plebiscite. We don't want it to lead to tyranny of majorities or minorities, and to turn decisions that are meant to be based on some kind of facts into popularity contests. There are lots of risks in doing this. So we should be honest about those risks, but it's not a reason to remain with the status quo of working behind closed doors with the absence of adequate information and without engaging with people who are affected by decisions. So I think the question is illustrative of a long list of hard questions. And it's why I come back to the original proposal, which is we have to be clear about what the goal is. If the goal is to hear what people's opinions are and to know what the majority of people think, that implies one design, versus if my goal is to, let's say, hear every possible opinion, but I don't necessarily care what the intensity of feeling is about that. Or if my goal is to get facts and data, how much traffic is there in this traffic circle, how many people in the community have this disease, that's a different goal than measuring citizen voice. And we can do them all efficiently as long as we're clear about which we're trying to do.
Time for one more question. Is there anything from the floor that we'd like to open up to? Yes, if you just head there, thank you.
Hello. Marco Berlinguer from Autonomous University of Barcelona, and thank you for your presentation. Well, I agree that we are experimenting, learning, and probably also having difficulties in implementing this idea about participation, because there were a lot of expectations, and probably we have to tune better the understanding of what happened and why many times it is not working as we expect. And so I would like to propose two elements. One is, of course, one of the biggest challenges that we face today is the enormous amount of solicitation of participation, engagement, and it's impossible. We don't have time, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the knowledge, and so the quality at the end of these processes is very low. The participation is low, and so forth. So probably we have to differentiate much more the idea and to attune the idea. For example, here in Spain, there was an experiment that was a political party called the Partido X, the X Party, that tried to design forms of participation designed around the process of production in the open source communities. The idea was to build expert systems rather than to crowdsource the participation to everybody on everything. So this idea could be an interesting innovation. The second thing that we observe more and more, and it's challenging, it's difficult, but probably it's going to be very important in the future, is that the participation, the way of producing information, included knowledge, is not so much designed according to the traditional forms of participation. Rather, it's designed and produced through the algorithms. So through doing things as a by-effect, we also can produce knowledge, information, which can be exploited and collected and transformed into knowledge.
So let me just let me respond simply by restating what you've just said, because I agree. I think working backwards, the second point that we're going to see new hybrid forms of engagement at the intersection between big data and engagement, where are going to be very much the future. I agree with you, whereby our activities, the breadcrumb that we leave in terms of the data exhaust we create, is a new way to engage that's very much underexplored and undervalued. The second piece, though, and this relates to the bigger point that I often talk about but didn't do so much today, which is to say that the core theoretical difference between what we're talking about here and the way we've traditionally thought about engagement is exactly your point of what I would call targeting. In other words, the notion voting is about one-size-fits-all participation. Everybody has to participate on everything in the same way. And in fact, and this is where big data also comes in, the ability to actually target and identify who knows what, so that we can decide not just to engage with everybody, but engage with certain people. So if I'm working on legislation about education, the notion that I can actually reach out to and I know who the teachers are. It's not hard to find them. That I can reach out to people who have certain kinds of know-how, who live in a particular neighborhood. We have to think about the use of expert systems to actually make engagement more targeted. It's an interesting question, coming back to the citizen science is so successful because people volunteer. They self-select to participate, and therefore they're more excited to participate than if it's some kind of thing that's mandated from on high. But the question of whether expert systems and big data can at the very least help to introduce people to opportunities they wouldn't know about. Oh, look, there's an opportunity to help write this law about education, and I'm a teacher. I might not otherwise even know to engage. The self-selection, the incentives are then important, but I think the combination of the two, and I'm so excited about this point. I wrote a whole book about expert systems because I think this is the wave of the future. It's not crowdsourcing, but smarter crowdsourcing, actually engaging with the right people at the right times and creating incentives for people to participate so that people are participating according to what they're passionate about and what they know, which means moving away from a very long-held idea that all participation has to be one size fits all, one way of participating, or else we don't do it. So lots of opportunities to participate in lots of different ways for everyone should be the future we're working towards.
Okay, well that does bring us to the end of this session. A big round of applause for Beth Noveck. Thank you very much.